Ialala e a Lelé são duas garotas do desacato. A Lala e a Lelé provocam até cenas de fuzilado. A Lala e a Lelé são duas garotas do desacato. A Lala e a Lelé provocam até cenas de fuzilado. Se alguém quer vir pro samba, olha a roda com a fé. Se quer loura tem Lala, se quer morena.
Hello, everybody. This is Sixtea, 60 minutes, a friend and a cup of tea. I'm sipping with friends who create the world. And today we are talking about Ida B. Wells. And I'm so excited about it. We're talking about Ida B. Wells together. Oh, and this is this is a special edition of Sixtea because we're talking to my friend, my old grappling partner, Taylor Marrow. Hello.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is awesome. I really appreciate it.
Yes. I'm so glad we're here to do this today. And I first I want to acknowledge also that it is autumn. This is a time when we are harvesting the fruits of our labor. And so I just want to acknowledge that for everybody who has special celebrations going on at this time, in this time of the year. I see you, I feel you. The energy is intense. I don't know if you feel that, Taylor, but I feel like the energy around us is really intense right now.
Yes, particularly living in Portland, experiencing the fires, I had, I had, friends that have lost their homes. It's been a very long process over the past 8 months, but really the past month, added on these fires have made things a little bit more stressful for all of us here in Portland. But the reality is, we're all hopeful, and we're gonna be bite off of Bob Marley, right? Trodden through Babylon, right?
Huh? Yes. I feel, dude, Bob Marley's in the air right now because I think you're the second person to reference him in the last 2 days. We need to listen to our prophets right now. I think that's what's coming through.
Without a doubt, we need to understand the context of what we're living in, and I think it ties really well with Ida B. Wells Barnett.
Yes, great segue into Ida B. Wells Barnett, the context that we're living in, because I've been telling you, I'm reading some of these writings that she had. I went to the college edu, the Chicago College.edu paper writings that they're sharing over there, the writings that she had about the lynchings, and the way she lays it out is like, I don't want to say smartass, but she's kind of just like, look, people, matter of fact, this is what it is, and you can't look away. It's and she does it in such an eloquent way. But before we get into that, let me do a proper introduction.
All right.
Friends, this is my friend Taylor Marrow. As I said before, we were grappling partners in jiu-jitsu long ago. He's instructor of diversity and equity at
history instructor. I used to be the diversity and equity officer, but I teach history.
Oh, yeah. Okay, because that was what was going to come next. Is that you are also a historian teaching history, and after kind of doing a deep dive into some of the stuff that I'm finding on you, you just have a thirst for understanding human evolution. It sounds like.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, and in particular for me, race relations, right? So I went into college. Really wanting to explore kind of my grandfather, the man I'm named after's experience cooking in World War II. And so one of my favorite things, I'm going to give shout out to Taylor Andre Marcy, one of my favorite things is that he cooked, right? And so he was a cook in World War II because that's all they allowed Black people to do, right? Secondary positions. And so he always cooked for my family every Sunday. And it's one of the things I honor him with. I love the process of it. It makes me feel so connected. It is such a relaxing one of those periods that put me in Zen. But The reality is, right, that I'm sorry, but the reality of it is, my experience was that, and then I got into graduate school in Indiana. My cousin sent me this book, this book it's called A Time of Terror, and it was a history of the last lynching that happened in Indiana, and it was about an hour and a half from where I went to college, and it really kind of opened my whole eye and my whole research and just my whole scholarship towards race relations, and I thank my cousin for sending me that book, and really kind of just getting that opportunity to be in a place that, although Indiana was horribly intolerant at times, also was rich in education and scholarship, and also in relationships I had.
Okay. All right. So you remember sort of the times that ignited you into this American way of race relations.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I didn't grow up here, and my parents are from New Orleans, in a levee town outside of New Orleans, and so they had identities around race that made sense to them: Black, African American, and even sometimes my dad is even like, I don't even know what this really means. Sometimes I hear my dad question that, but I was born and raised overseas in an international community. Mm-hmm. So when my parents were talking about race, it seemed like this foreign thing that was as foreign as when they talked about their home country, which was the United States. And so when I came here, the race relations, the identity and race, and how Black people looked at me and white people looked at me and all of that was so confounding to me. And I actually went through an identity crisis around race for a long time in my life, because I just didn't understand, because ultimately it's real because we bought into it, but it's also not real because it was just made up by enough people that decided to say yes. So it's quite a paradox, and I'm sure you have a lot to say about. I'm sure you talk to a lot of people who have stories like me, actually.
Yeah, and it's I think you use a good term. It's a paradox, and it's also really complex.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I deal with as a historian is oftentimes, the thing I'm really just trying to shy away, just not only my own thinking, my own scholarship, but just my own kind of pedagogy towards my students is, away from reductionism, right? I mean, the world does not have simple answers, right? We live in a complex world, which means, there are complex answers. Yes, we can look into simple solutions, but there are so many things, that are interconnected, that we really have to stop reducing, particularly history, down to very easy to understand narratives, right? Because what I love about history, what I love about Ida B. Wells, what I love about the Black freedom struggle and race relations is that it's a onion, right? It's this thing that there's so many deep layers to it, and oftentimes all people see is just the peel, right? When we take the peel away, then right, we're good. We're all on an onion, right? But the reality is, right, that peel is an important layer, right?
Yeah, and I think that's something that I'm noticing in sort of activism and communities around activism right now, is that even within activism, there's that way of interrelating with each other, which is it's either this or that. We have to do it this way or that way, and it's to build a new world. I don't think that we can be so single-minded or single-focused.
Yes, without a doubt, right?
It doesn't represent human beings.
Yes, and it doesn't represent the nuances of social justice, right? I mean, when you were talking about, Ida B. Wells' writing and how articulate she was, but more important, how matter of fact, I think was the word you used, right? And that is this tradition historians call muckraking, right? This history of from like the late 1870s up to about 1940 of expose journalism that existed. Ida Tarbell is another important muckraker, but with photo expose journalism.
Muckraking.
Yes. It is it was a very important aspect of the progressive era in U.S. history. And when I'm talking about progressive era, I'm not talking about when people say progressive in the 21st century. I'm talking about this era of reform in the United States.
Yeah.
You know, you had very important works of muckrakers, for example. And I need to find this muckraker's name really, really quickly.
While you're doing that, let me just read this definition.
Yeah.
Muckraking, the action of searching out, publicizing scandalous information about people in an underhanded way.
Well,
this happens in Shakespeare.
Yeah, and some people would call it underhanded, but in the progressive era connotation, no, because again, it included Ida Tarbell, that was really focused on photo expose journalism of child labor. So, like exposing child labor through photography. Ida B. Wells in her 3 lynching pamphlets, The Red Record, Southern Horrors, and Mob Rule in New Orleans, again exposing this hypocrisy of lynching, exposing the fallacy of black male sexual assault on white females.
Yes.
And then the one that I was looking up is arguably one of the most important, which is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. So I have a lot of friends that are vegetarians, and a lot of my friends that are vegetarians became vegetarians because of Upton Sinclair's the book he wrote, which was called The Jungle, which was this expose journalistic view of a immigrant family in a Chicago meatpacking plant, where his purpose was to show how hard it was for this family, but the result and how people took it was how nasty American food was, and it led to the Pure Food and Drug Act and Pure Food and Meat Act, and eventually precursor to the FDA or to the Meat Inspection Act.
Taylor, before we go on, because we probably can talk for hours. Before we go on, let me just ask a couple of questions that my Sixtea audience is going to want to know. And the first one is just about you. Mm-hmm. Is there something significant that you can share, like something that you discovered about yourself that's pretty significant in this interesting year that is 2020?
So I would say the biggest significant thing I have discovered is grace, right? So my entire life I've been a pretty, confident and to some extent arrogant. I'm from New Jersey, right? I that is my home. I'm a black person from New Jersey too. Like I'm the baby out of 5. I'm 5'6" on a good day. So I am loud. I am obnoxious because that's just like the culture I grew up in. But the thing I really understood in this process is grace, that human beings are a resilient creature. And if we give each other the grace to be resilient, we will rise, right? We'll like, and I don't want to be cliche like Phoenix rising at, but right, if we have a setback or a delay, we can meet other expectations. And I think the fallacy of this modern era, particularly as I look at like my child in school and then my job, which is teaching, is yes, students are going to struggle, right? But ultimately, in 10 years, they live in the United States, which means the vast majority of them do well. So let's focus on those that aren't. Let's create those equitable opportunities for those that can't, because we've got to build resiliency in the communities that don't have resilience, right?
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. And building the resilience in the communities that don't have resilience. I feel like I experienced that on a personal level. Whatever you do in here, it's going to reflect out there. And I feel like that's something that I see in this sort of current revolution that we're in. And that is more people who are sort of in the fight or really wanting to create a better new world I'm seeing a shift in them talking more about taking care of themselves really well. And so that they have that resilience, realizing that if they're going to keep being in this fight or go against a system that wants to keep them down, that they have to have longevity, and in building that longevity, resilience is coming out. Not just light, but like sustainable light that touches other people's lights, that keeps vibrating. So yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Sure.
And the other one is, if you could be sipping tea with anyone, who would it be and why?
So if I could sip tea with anyone, who would it be? Why? It would totally be Jerry Garcia.
Jerry Garcia.
It would be Jerry Garcia. Why? Because I'm a deadhead. I spent
No.
years, very informative years of my life following the band around and enjoying his music and traveling from show to show. It allowed me to see like every single state, just about, except for North Dakota, Alaska, Hawaii, and Louisiana are the only states I have not seen. So, trouncing around following Jerry Garcia was awesome, and I would like to thank him, because like it changed who my circle of friends are and family are, right? It expanded it. It's brought me some of the most robust relationships in my life. But more importantly, it's given me a better concept of how to love the world, and where I am in that process of finding myself in the world, and trying to experience, what humans all try to experience, right? The joy, the pain, and doing right.
Sorry, I got kicked out of my own studio. I'm glad you're still here.
It's all good. That totally happens, especially this time of day, right? A lot of internet usage.
It's the fall equinox. The Mercury's in retrograde. We're at the end of the day, and we're talking about powerful stuff. So you just brought Jerry Garcia's spirit in. So yeah, I think we're gonna have some technical hiccups here.
Yeah, he's my guy.
Awesome. So my friend, let's get more into Ida B. Wells. And before we do that, can we set the scene of when she was living? She was living during Jim Crow era.
Yeah, so Ida B. Wells Barnett was born in 1862. And 1862 is a very pivotal year, because it was in the summer of 1862, in August, that Abraham Lincoln issued the Provisional Emancipation Proclamation. And this gave the South the opportunity to come back into the Union before January 1st and hold their slaves and maintain their slaves, right? So she's born in this era of, hope, but also this era where, in the modern, understanding, there's a lot of mythology and be quite frank, falsehoods, right? The Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves in the Union. It only freed slaves that were in rebellion against the Union. So this is the world that she comes up in. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation comes out in January. And then by 1865, the war is over, and it's moving to this process of Reconstruction, where African Americans, where Black people get political rights. They become governors, senators, and congressmen of state. They become congressmen and senators at the federal government level. And then there's the process afterwards. And this is when she's in her latter teens and her early 20s, very formative years. That is this low period in race relations called the nadir of race relations. And the nadir of race relations really is this period that exists from, the 1875, 1870, really, if you want to be, got it down to when you see lots of racial violence flaring up, to about 1915. And this is a process where white supremacy is being reestablished, not only through law, but through extra legal violence, or violence without legal sanction. And this is what Ida B. Wells grows up in an era where there's opportunity, where she has rights.
Yeah.
In an era where she's seeing these rights being stripped away slowly but surely.
Do you think that people were as confused back then about what these laws being passed meant as we are now?
No. So particularly not in the South, right?
Okay.
The reality of the South, and throughout the nation, right, it is a society that was built in this idea that white people were supreme. They were the master race. There is this dominant ideology where the center right, is that Black and white people cannot live together. Those communities are incompatible, right? And so this is the root of it, right? And so even though Black people demonstrate during Reconstruction the ability to govern, the ability to pass law, the ability to rule justly, it is this long-held notion of incompatibility of the races that fuels this nadir, that fuels this low point in race relations, where you have massacres in 1871 in Ellington, South Carolina, right, where 30 African Americans are killed and they burn towns to the ground, right, or Meridian, where 17 are killed and they burn towns to the ground, without any, without any fear of being prosecuted by the law, and wasn't just a rare occurrence; it was a common occurrence in this country.
See, that is like, I've heard these stories, and in doing some research in Ida B. Wells and also recently Blackdom, and having a deeper understanding of Jim Crow laws, it's still hard for me to wrap my head around that. It's still just, in my time now, like I live in the center of Portland, I live downtown, like all the protests and everything are like 6-7 blocks away. And the Proud Boys are down there doing whatever the thing is that they're doing. And I'm just like, the fear that I have of, and I don't walk in fear, but like there are days when I'm like, I shouldn't go outside. Today is not a day where I should walk to the grocery store freely. I shouldn't walk with my headphones off. I shouldn't wear shoes I can't run in. Those are the thoughts that I really do have living in downtown Portland. That is a little stressful enough, right? I can't imagine coming right off of an era where like my grandparents or my parents were probably slaves, if not my grandparents.
Yeah. And
people are being lynched and disappearing in droves.
Yes, by the thousand.
And then how Ida B. Wells can be in that time and write the way muckraking and writing the way she is in the South.
Yeah, well, part of it is right. This was a tradition that she had early in life. So it was like 1883 or 1884 when she was moving to Memphis. She was taking she was riding in a train car. Actually, this is before riding in a train car, and so she was in the women's car. And this is before de jure racism, before legalized racism and legalized segregation.
De jure racism.
Yeah, that is racism by law. That was sanctioned in the United States in 1896, I believe. Plessy versus Ferguson. That was the decision that said America could legally segregate Black and white people as long as the facilities were separate but equal was the legal standard. But Ida B. Wells was forcefully moved from the women's car to the smoking car because she was Black. And so it's one of my favorite stories she recounts in her autobiography, where she's talking about this train conductor coming and grabbing her. And so he put his hands on her, and literally she said, I braced myself for him coming to grab me, and I bit his hand with everything that I had. This is when she was about 17 or 18.
And she knows that there's lynchings going on, and she knows that the United States has decided to make further separations based on color, and she knows she's already been removed from a place where she doesn't belong physically in that same train.
Yes, and she wins the legal case. She takes it to court. She wins, but eventually the Tennessee Supreme Court overturns it after Plessy becomes the law of the land. That was the nature of what she grew up in. But I think it really, again, back to that muckraking tradition she comes from, and pushed her to this activism, to this role of towards social justice, which I think is an important thing to recognize about her, is that she was not only a woman that was extraordinary, right? And again, I mean in a literal tense, like out of the ordinary, right? People oftentimes use that term extra. No, we're talking about this. Or then there's Ida B. Wells that is, extraordinary.
Yes.
That was articulate. She was a Black woman, right? And she was not afraid to write the raw words that were calling out and calling to account the system that was killing Black people without the right to judge, jury, prosecution, right? Which I would argue is, for me as a Black person, the problem with this, with the extrajudicial police killing. And I leave that term extrajudicial mean is when a cop kills a person outside of the justice system, outside of being prosecuted and adjudicated, that is something we have to take with real concern, right? I mean, it's people are asking, what, like Ida B. Wells, one of the things she said, right? We want to get the scoundrel as much as any person out there, right? It's not that Black people want people to commit crimes. What we're suggesting in the modern era with Black Lives Matter, as well as what Ida B. Wells Barnett was suggesting, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, is that Black people, right, need to be held to the same standard of law, to the same equitable outcomes as a white person, as any person is.
Yes. And I get a lot of memes on Facebook and stuff. And one of the memes was so powerful. It's just such an interesting theory, like the way they put it. And it was so real. And it was like, police aren't supposed to kill guilty people either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, guilty or innocent, they're not supposed to kill innocent people, right? But the fact that they were saying they're not supposed to kill guilty people either kind of put in this perspective of like, oh yeah, they're just killing anybody. Like it doesn't, they are, like you said, are operating outside of the law. And when George Floyd, and this is what I'm starting to call it, when George Floyd was lynched, it feels like it's the most appropriate for what's going on. And I've been encouraging people to, if they don't feel comfortable saying lynch, to say when X or XY, when Breonna Taylor was murdered. I'm encouraging people and changing my vocabulary around that myself, because the police are not supposed to be murdering. Yeah. That's just not what they're supposed to be doing. It's not what I don't think it's what they're trained to do. I don't think that's what their training is.
A lot of it is, that's what many, not trained to murder, but trained to shoot to kill, right? This is the aspect of it, right? Like, and I don't know, like, again, what I'm talking about with cops is a very small view from television. Before I get that, I want to amend what I said earlier, which was that what is important is equitable outcomes. That's not important. What's important is equitable opportunity, right? We cannot suggest that everyone get equitable outcome. We can suggest that people get equitable opportunity, right? And that's what Black people want, right? We want equitable opportunity within our justice system, right? Yes. Be held to the same account of law as any other human being under the American system of justice. And that's what is fundamentally missing, right? That's what's missing when a police officer or even a regular citizen kills a human being outside of the judicial system, right? And me personally, I'm not a big fan of capital crime, right? But I'm not necessarily against it. I do understand that if you look at the rates of capital murder and the crime that people are put to death for, it's by and large Black people, even though they represent a small fraction of the people that numbers that commit that. So, the whole system is, reflective of this era that Ida B. Wells critiqued. If you're looking at the justice system, if you're looking at the system of social control, right? That's what Ida B. Wells, and talked about that. The belief was we control Black people and Black men, because if you don't, what are they going to do? They're going to go out and rape and murder and kill. Right? So
that's what they believed.
Yes, exactly. And this, again, right? This is supported by, science of the time.
Science.
At the time, right? Like, right.
Okay, so one thing that I was watching a review on Ida B. Wells by this professor. I wish I remembered his name. He's like he's like one of those OGs from the 70s. He always has on like a dashiki, and like every time he gets interviewed, I cannot remember his name, but you might know who he is. And I've seen him do several interviews on I think some of the history stuff that you're into. So but every time he's getting interviewed, he's in his office and it's just like so covered in books that there's really there's really only space for him and a camera. He's old, he's like white hair and whatever. I think you know what I'm talking about. I just can't remember his name. And someone was interviewing him about Ida B. Wells, and something he pointed out, and it made my mind go back to my history when I was learning. We talked about her in history for a minute. We talked about Ida B. Wells for like 3 paragraphs. And this picture that we were looking at earlier, I remember that being in my history book. So she did make it to a history book for me being a 37-year-old woman. So it was in my history book for a second. And one of the things he pointed out, and I think this is so important for our times, because a lot of what's happening right now is the veil is being pulled back so that we can see things for what they really are. And he was saying it's important to understand that there was some sort of mystification around that the lynchings were to protect white women and children, but ultimately people being lynched were really people who were succeeding, who were entrepreneurs, who were somehow a competition for their white counterparts in business or whatever. And so I found that to be very, like, how often do we experience that in, like, I think it lends to the same thing of like when we see a black man on TV who committed crime and a white man, and it's like the black man, they're you know, the way they talk about him as opposed to like the way they talk about the white man is very different. It's a tactic that is age old and it keeps repeating.
Yeah, it is. So again, I think, so for me, what I have been geeking out on, you know, outside of, you know, my fascination with American race, my minor in college was looking at the rise of fascism and Nazism. And so the thing I've been geeking out on is propaganda, right? And so, you know, people oftentimes will talk about Goebbels as this propaganda master, where really, if you look at the genesis of kind of the modern media propaganda, began with in the United States in World War I with George Creel, who headed Committee on Public Information, the CPI. And this is really the root of modern propaganda. And you can trace modern propaganda, racial propaganda, really back to the essence of Jim Crow, right? So Jim Crow is this idea, right? It carries 2 definitions. It's literally a literal, you know, caricature that was portrayed in the 1830s in minstrel shows of a white man that would dress up in blackface and go out and travel around in minstrel shows and buffoon and play up the racist caricatures of a black person, you know, lazy, ignorant, dirty, can barely talk. And then it also, this euphemism, right? The second definition, the euphemism for the system of segregation. So they call it Jim Crow laws, right? So it's this root of this initial propaganda that really is rooted in the minstrel show, blackface, of white people taking black identity and mocking it, and taking it from, you know, that, I wouldn't even call it benign, or that, so that rudimentary, that easy, right? Like, oh, here's a minstrel show, right? To, you know, what used to exist in Oregon and Washington, which was Coon Shack Chicken, right? Which was this chicken place you could go to. So I don't know if you're familiar, on Northeast Sandy, there's Clyde's Prime Rib, which is a black business. It's not black owned, but they have jazz and a lot of black bands and blues bands.
Yeah.
Used to be called country, or what, Coon Shack Chicken, which was this chain of restaurants on the West Coast that had a big giant black faced person, and men were in blackface, right? So this is the root and the depth of racial propaganda, right? That you could, as a white person, you know, go see a minstrel show. You could go see, you know, early Mickey Mouse shows that portrayed black people as buffoons, right? You could go see 1950, you could see Birth of a Nation, which was, also known as The Klansman, right? That was the book into this race, horribly racist stereotype typical movie. You could go and play games like throw watermelon at the N-word, right? You could go and you literally you could feed black babies to alligators in Florida. And these things are all, you can trace this. There's a whole museum, if you want to know about it. It's a fascinating museum. It's called the Museum of Jim Crow, or the Jim Crow Museum. It is one of the greatest repositories for racist memorabilia, and it really helps, I think, my students, but also the world to understand. So how could someone do that? Like, how could someone go and see someone lynched, mutilated, and burned? Well, when you're sitting there, playing like one little, two little, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch an N-word by his toe, right? Or you're like, going, playing, throw the ball.
They're conditions. It's a conditioning. It's part of white supremacy. My understanding is that this is part of white supremacism, is to look at people with dark skin as inhuman. And the more that science that can prove it, and the more games and songs and culture that we have around to support it, then you can and propaganda, like you're talking about, you can program somebody's mind. And this is what's interesting about Ida B. Wells' writing as a muckraker, is I feel like she sort of takes that programming and she unfolds it very well in her writing. She's very skilled in that. I read the Marriage Bells article she did, and I'm going to forget some of the details, but it was so interesting because it sounded like the way she started it was like, there's this beautiful union happening. And she describes like the young strapping man, she uses better words, but like the young strapping man and this woman, this beautiful woman, and then she just unravels into this terrible thing that happens, and at the end she goes back to the wedding, and it's beautiful. And I'm like, this type of spy, this type of ninja, this type of like infiltrate this system that has programmed people and used all this propaganda and program, infiltrate it, get them interested, open them up with things that titillate their minds, and then drop the truth on them. That is the way you have to unravel from the inside.
Yeah, you gotta be persistent, right? I mean, I think that the thing that people forget again, right? People forget that Ida B. Wells wrote about her friends in Memphis that were lynched. They owned this business called the People's Grocery. And it's part of the reason why they left Memphis. And they had this grocery that they opened up, and it was a mercantile, or like a small version of Walmart in the modern era. And they opened up People's Grocery across the street from a white mercantile. The owners of the white mercantile armed themselves and went over and accosted the black mercantile. They protected themselves, shot them. These upstanding men, some of the wealthiest black men in Memphis, highest educated black men in Memphis, were taken out of jail and lynched. And so she wrote about this. They ended up burning down her press, throwing it in the river, and she went up to Chicago, where she met her husband, and then she ended up writing about lynching. But the key that she talked about was that, again, she said, and one of the things that's most fascinating she talked about was this, that hey, it's not that black men rape white women. What it is that they get involved in consensual relationships. And in these consensual relationships, when that woman is when her family asked her what happened, she has no other option in any sort of cultural or social structure but to accuse sexual assault. And that's what she argued. And her life was put under, she was under death threats if she returned to this house. She had to stay up to the north and continue to write and continue her struggle.
I just, going back to the era and the time, I now, as a woman who still, like, I will say I'm black to cut to the chase with people sometimes. And if people call me black or African American, I'm not offended by that at all. But I still don't totally understand. Like, that's just not my, I just don't, I never say, I just don't have that really deep identity of black or African American. I think more African heritage. I think, from my point of view, I'm thinking more spirit in terms of like construction of melanin, you know, and that's just like my path, you know, and even now, you know, I'm a spiritual teacher. I teach about racism from that spiritual perspective. Even when I'm just online in discovery talking about my specific experience, which has nothing to do with attacking anybody else or putting anybody else down. It's just like this is what's going on inside me, and this is what happened, and this is my journey. Even just talking about race, talking about things that I see I don't like. I don't like to use names when I talk about it. I don't like to use determining details either to talk about people. I just talk about it in general terms. Even then, it is astounding how before I had really good protection and standards and boundaries on my pages, it was astounding to me how many, well, it was white people showed up that were just insulted by the truth of my story, but me talking about my story. How many people showed up to tell me you are lying? So, and for me being very sensitive, like that would, like it, sometimes it makes me want to go, I don't even know if I want to talk about this anymore. I don't know if I want to teach about this anymore. She was in Jim Crow, in the Jim Crow era, and she was like printing in paper and distributing it during lynching times.
Yeah. It was, again, I think it's a testament to, part of it is to the human experience, but I would say, and again, as a person that's been raised Black in this country, as part of the Black experience, this idea that, you know, it's an indomitable spirit, right? And again, all races have demonstrated indomitability in times of trial and tribulation, right? When things get bad, the general human kind of response is, oh, we got to buck up, right? We've got to figure out a way to get this done. It is by and large a general human experience. But when you're looking at the Black experience in the U.S., right, Ida B. Wells is very symbolic of this idea that you have to push for change, right? I mean, as a person, as a Black person, I don't see American democracy as a static thing. For me to see it as a static thing means I have to see it as being something that used to be, you know, this perfect thing, right? And that's not the truth, because that's not what it was, right? I mean, that's not the experience of me. It's not the experience of my parents, my grandparents, not the experience of my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, right? That's not the narrative of the vast majority of Black people. But there's a narrative of power, a narrative of resilience, a narrative of community, a narrative of persevering, a narrative of activism. And all these things have influenced American democracy, right? Have influenced American thinking. And, you know, right now I would argue this, right? Yeah, it sucks, right? You know, we can point at the current president. We can point at, you know, the rise in intolerance, the rise in racial violence as these really bad problems, which they are. But we also got to remind ourselves, right, that what historians ask people is to not be presentism. Avoid presentism. Presentism is judging the past. Yes, judging the past by present standards. So we've got to avoid this idea of looking at the past by present standards, understanding that the past was very, very bad and needs to be changed, but also recognizing that you can't throw out the whole baby with the bathwater.
Yes, I keep hearing this phrase.
That's right. Yeah. You can't throw out the whole baby with the bathwater, because the idea of, for me, the idea of American liberalism, and I would argue this is, to some extent, is the root of kind of even, you know, the Black muckraking spirit, the progressive Black spirit, the new Negro in the early 20th century. This idea that we can be a part of, you know, this liberal idea, not talking like conservative liberal in U.S. perspective. I'm talking about traditional liberalism, this idea of progress, right? Progress and stability, right, is really kind of the root of classical liberalism. This idea that you believe in freedom and progress, right? Liberty, right? The root, liberty. So freedom and progress, right? So individual freedom, which I believe in, liberty, right? But also progress. We don't want a stagnant society. We want society that's going to grow. And as a Black person, I think we are part of that. And Ida B. Wells really was showing she's part of that with her writing.
Dude, I just... why do you think she's left out of our history books? I mean, I know a lot of people didn't have her in her history books. Why do you think that she occupies so little space, if not no space, in history books?
No, so it's pretty foul, right? So there's a couple lynching bills that are stalled. There's one in the Senate that's stalled. There's another one that's passed. And they're trying to merge them. But Ida B. Wells isn't mentioned in the name of it, like in the name of either federal lynching bill, which is I find astounding, considering her work. I mean, they recognize her at the federal level, but I would argue her names needs to be. I mean, the Emmett Till bill. I think that's important that Emmett Till is called out too. But I think Ida B. Wells should be called out just as much. I would say this: if you look at America and the United States, a lot of it has to do with sexism, right? I mean, I don't want to sound cliche, right? And again, for me, this is a personal belief. I don't really have fact to back this up, but this is a personal belief. One of my personal beliefs of why Hillary Clinton didn't get elected is not that she was a bad candidate, and people will say that. It's that she was a woman, and that there are men that just can't fathom a woman in power, a woman fitting in a role that isn't that hasn't been the construct of kind of typical culture.
Mm-hmm.
American culture.
Yeah. Whew. So, Taylor.
Yes.
Did you bring a presentation to share?
No. So, I talked about a lot. I talked about some of the presentation. Yeah. So, I gave a couple tidbits from this presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, and about her activism. I think I covered a lot about Ida B. Wells. I would say this and a couple other things, right? So we know her for her lynching campaign, her anti-lynching campaign.
Yeah.
She's also, again, she was one of the founding members of the United Negro Women. So, what is it? The National Association of Colored Women. So she's a founding member of the NACW, National Association of Colored Women. She's also a founding member of the NAACP.
I didn't know that.
Yes, right. So again, right, when we're thinking about Ida B. Wells, it's not just her activism in lynching; it's her, it's her whole belief about activism and social justice. Right? In Chicago, she ran organizations that helped Black people during the Great Migration. The Great Migration was this very important period in Black history where African Americans left the South for the North in industrial jobs during World War I and World War II. So one of my ideas, one of my hypotheses, one of my theories is that, part of why you see some of the indicators of Black culture lagging behind whites besides racism is this process, this period of migration that happened. So if you look at the Great Migration, which began about 1914, right, ended about 1945, something like 90% of Black people lived in the South. So Black people were Southern people. But the job they did in the South was primarily agriculture. So Black people, for the dominant history of this country, were rural agricultural people. Right? So that's the completely different rhythm of life than urban industrialized life.
Yeah.
But that is a person that, in a civilization and a society and a culture that grew up around large families, large gatherings, even though they had to make extended kinship networks, right? People might have been sold down the river, right? And, you find an aunt, an uncle, a mammy, a pappy, and people in your tribe, right? So, they're living in the rhythms of sun up to sundown. Then you take that population in the period of, 1915 to 1945, you move more, the vast majority of them from the South to the North, you put them in high-rise apartments and crowded apartments and tenement houses. They work in industry, right? Yes, they're going to make more, but by 1960, you have deindustrialization. So you take all these people that have jobs, but by 1960, they're deindustrialized. So that means they used to, at least on the farm, have agriculture. Now they've got the city without jobs, which means they have nothing.
And you know what's so interesting about that, and this is something that we talk about over Africa Week 2020 a lot, is this wave of Black people coming back to agriculture. We've had a few panels on this of agriculturalists from like Uganda and wanting to bring more Black Americans, but not being able to find Black Americans who do agriculture. But I know just in my spiritual world, there's a big movement right now of Black people going back to agriculture and sort of reclaiming this thing that it's a lot of who we are as descendants of Black
West Africa. Yes, Black Africans. Yes. Right. I mean, rice farming came to the Americas because of West African Black people. Right. That's how they started growing rice in South Carolina. Right. And so without a doubt, Black people have been engaged. The problem is, right, and this is again another part of the problem that I point out, although some people would say no, that's a fallacy, but there's a lot of kind of evidence that supports part of the problem is, Black people never owned land, right? So throughout our history, we had some that owned land, but the vast majority were working free, right, in agriculture, and during slavery, then after slavery, working as tenant farmers or sharecroppers, right? And so this really inhibited the, prosperity, wealth, but I also think it inhibited sustainability for Black people in agriculture. Because if you don't own land, it's hard to be a farmer.
Dude. So never owned anything. Okay, never owned anything. Was just given sovereignty over their own life.
Mm-hmm.
Was being terrorized wherever they go.
Mm-hmm.
Was also being bamboozled not only by some of their interracial relationships they're having, but also by the government itself. Mm-hmm. Having nowhere really to call home. I mean, I'm just mentioning a few things. And then and then this thing about okay, the things that we're actually that we having to break into other industries by necessity because the things that we're good at we can't even really own for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that, like, when I was in graduate school that struck me when I was reading, I took a couple classes on the Civil War, when I was reading kind of Black firsthand experiences and, a couple chapters out of textbooks was this process that immediately happened once the war stopped, which was, you read white people's writing and they're like, the Black people are just milling around. It seems like they're walking around aimlessly because the streets were filled with Black people moving around because they were free. And so what they were trying to do was find their families, find their loved ones that had been sold down the river.
No.
White observers, it looked like aimless milling about, but that's what historians call it, milling about. But there was a purpose, and this was finding their kids, finding their husband, finding their wife.
The door, asking in communities and churches, and like this is what they look like, and this is what I think their name was before they got renamed.
Totally, exactly. And then once they established those relationships, again, like you said, they didn't have anything. So what do this is the thing a student asked me, is like, so why did they do that? So, what happened to them after that is they returned to the place they knew, which was the plantation. I have students ask me why. Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, that's what the North wanted, right? They wanted a docile workforce. They wanted the South to get back to producing, and that meant Black workers. But also part of it is if you're a Black person, you don't got money, you don't got land. This is before the Industrial Revolution. Where are you going to go? You don't have an education. All you got is your family. So many of them returned to the only place they knew, which is the plantation. And this is the thing that I think the language I talk about when I talk about human trafficking in the slave trade is that I call it human trafficking, right? I don't call it slavery, right? It's human trafficking in slavery. These human beings were held as hostages on plantations, right? And they were trafficked by other humans. Some for sport purpose, some for sexual purpose, some for financial purposes. But this was the reality of human beings. And so, you know, I think oftentimes, so why would someone go back to that situation? It's that, even in that situation, we're humans. And one of the great things about us as a species is hope. And even in that hell, our ancestors had hope. They had hope that I'd be here, you would be here, right? We'd be able to engage, even though there are problems, but they had that hope, right? They had this belief that things were going to change. And fundamentally, how did that belief manifest? It manifested in our songs, manifested in our religion, manifested in our stories, it manifested in our food, it manifested in the way we talk, manifested in the way we wear our clothes, right? Manifested in the way we walk, right? I mean, this is our resistance, our resilience. This is us expressing who we are. And that's what is one of, again, one of the beauties of that horrible hellfire of racism and slavery that Ida B. Wells grew up in. It also created, blackness, which the world strives for, right? If you look at popular culture is blackness worldwide. You go to Russia, motherfucker, they rapping in Russia, right? They're wearing their hats tilted in Russia.
They're doing reggae in Finland. Yeah.
They're doing reggae in Finland, right? Exactly. Yeah. Right, they were playing jazz in France after World War II, right? They were World War I. They're like, wait, what is this music? We need to start this, right? And that introduced jazz into the world in Europe, right? And so that's why they do that, because it's different.
One of the things that really stood out to me, because of what we were talking at the beginning of this conversation of race and how we identify with race, and that is Ida B. Wells writes in some of the accounts I was reading, she writes Afro-Americans. It wasn't African American yet. It was, and I've heard Afro-American here as well, like in our time now. But I wonder, can you speak to that evolution? I mean, obviously different groups identify in different ways, but can you speak to sort of that evolution?
Yes, totally. So it's a very complex and tricky evolution. And typically people ask what a Black person likes to be called. Like, I like to be called Black. So it initially started out as Negro, right? And then it was colored. Then it became African American. And so, Negro was one of the initial periods after Reconstruction, right? During Reconstruction was like 1865 to 1876 was Reconstruction. End of 1876, 1877, you have Reconstruction over. And Negro was the term. Then it became colored, right? And then colored lasts about, the end of the 1950s. Then 1960s became African American. And then in the 1970s, it just became, late 60s, the Black Power movement, it just became Black.
Yeah.
And, I think Ida B. Wells grew up in this era. They were experimenting with the term Negro and colored and Afro-American. And so I think that might be part of the reflection of why she has Afro-American. Also, she traveled to Europe, right? That's, part of her campaign was international, right? She spoke in Britain. She had this international campaign against lynching. So she was exposed to Africans, right? So I think that's a bit of it too, just like W.E.B. Du Bois, right? I think their consciousness changed when they were exposed to Africa and Africans, right? They saw it bigger than just Black people in the United States, right? And that's what is important. And as I talk to my students about Marcus Garvey, right? This idea of Pan-Africanism, right, that he got from Edward Wilmot Blyden in the late 19th century, or Blyden in the 19th century was this Black man, this African that looked at Pan-Africanism just in Africa. Marcus Garvey looked at Pan-Africanism as a global phenomenon, as the whole African diaspora.
Yes. Yes. That's one thing that I keep coming back to, because I didn't grow up here. And also I had a big trip where I spent a month in West Africa this time last year. And I had a lot of things go on for me inside that was like, wow, I am not African. And then the next day I'd be like, wow, I am African. And then I just like went back and forth. And I know what my identity journey is, but I wonder how Black American identity journey would have been different had we kept segregated schools,
Mhm.
and that the people we learned about and studied were Marcus Garvey and Ida B. Wells,
Yes.
W. Du Bois,
Yeah.
Tina Turner.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So my mom and my grandma, and I believe in integration, but my mom and my grandma have a couple big criticisms of integration, right? And that was, if you look at, 1927 Black America, 1935 Black America, and you walked into a town or a city of that had a Black section, you would have a Black barber, you'd have Black doctors, Black dentists, Black owned grocers, right? So you had this really rooted Black infrastructure that had been developed, this financial infrastructure, this infrastructure in business, infrastructure in society and in culture and church, social organizations like the Freemasons, like the Black Elks Clubs. And then once you had integration, these things broke apart. And that's one of their criticisms, that integration really kind of, it undermined that unity, economic, cultural and social unity that had existed in the separate, segregated Black institutions in the United States.
Is that so? When did Ida B. Wells die?
She died, I believe it was, let me find out. Sorry, I think it was I'm going to say it was 1940 something. It was like maybe 1946.
Oh, so it was well before they were really even talking about integration.
Yeah, so she died 1931. Sorry, wow. Yeah, so 1962 to 1931. Yeah.
So do you think that obviously she had a lot going on with her activism around anti-lynching?
Mm-hmm.
Also, do you think that she was moving towards, I mean, because it was already segregated at that time. What was she like around the community building aspects? Because this is something that I feel that, activism has a wide range. And I think that there's some activism that's like, let's fight everyone, even the people who are also fighting for what we are fighting for. There's that activism, and right. And then there's like soft activism where you might come in and vote on something and then you're done. Is that a really activism? I don't know. Some people might call it, but I'm getting really interested in this, the aspects of community building activism. And so I wonder what you would say in terms of Ida B. Wells. Was she building communities?
Yeah. So once she left Memphis, she went to Chicago where she met her husband. Mm-hmm. Her husband was the publisher of a Black-owned newspaper, so she was in that tradition of the Black-owned newspaper. She also was a community activist. Again, she was a founding member of the National Association of Colored Women, National Association NAACP for the Advancement of Colored People. Her and her husband also started a couple Chicago social organizations to provide jobs and housing for African Americans leaving the South for the North during the Great Migration. So she was, again, this really big social activist throughout Chicago. Right? It wasn't just lynching. It was this idea that in order for her to, in order for Black people to progress, her activism needed to get all aspects, tap into the community, provide opportunity, give Black people a leg up, give them a hand up, so they could find opportunity and be successful.
Which is something that in our current revolution that Black Lives Matter has a great stake in or much popularity in. I like to say Black Lives Movement. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I like that better. Black Lives Movement. One of the things I'm finding that I am having to, with pleasure, educate people on is that it's not just about saving a Black man from getting shot. Mm-hmm. That is not the only thing that this Black Lives Movement or that Black Lives Matter.
Very different tip of the iceberg, right? The iceberg is education. Right? The iceberg is education. The iceberg is healthcare. Right? The iceberg is home ownership. The iceberg is business ownership, loans. Right? Possibly reparations. I don't believe white people want to give it to us, but maybe we can talk about that. But there's a whole rooted system that leads to that is manifested, I would say, in in violence. And, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, I think, so for me as a Portlander, again, I get, as a historian, you know, I support the ideas behind it, right? Black Lives Matter, people matter. I hate that it's been reduced to a sign in my town. Driving around, right, seeing people with signs in their car, it doesn't make me feel comfortable. That doesn't make me feel accepted, right? It just makes me feel like Portlanders are you know, taking the easy route. Particularly a person that's been an activist in my kids' education, right? The neighborhood I live in, it's changing, but when I first moved here 10 years ago, my kid went to a Title I school where, you know, 78% of the kids were free and reduced lunch. Most of the wealthy white families in my neighborhood sent their kids to another school because they were afraid of it. Right? They're afraid to send their kids, and that's the problem. And so, like, you know, if you're going to put a Black Lives Matter sign in your, then you need to get school district boundaries redrawn. The money of your school across the river, you know, Lincoln High School, you know, where their foundation gets, you know, $80,000 to $150,000 a year in donations, they need to have their high school and blended with poor high school, right?
Yeah.
Change the boundaries, right? They need to bust it. They need to disperse that. And the
Which
parents be happy for it.
Then I can see why there's the argument and the criticism of segregation. It's like, okay, but if we segregate, then we have to make these things equal. Now, holding United States accountable for that is a different thing. But okay, if we're going to have segregation, then here's the line. And that school, if it makes a certain percentage more, then that percentage naturally comes over to the, you know, however they want to do it.
Part of it is this, you know, what's segregating is the district, right? And this is what bugs me, right? So, and I know I shifted the conversation, but this is bugs me, right?
That's okay, but this all has to do with the things that Edmund Wells is building on.
I don't believe anyone has the right. There's no constitutional right to you buying a piece of property, a house, and you having a right to a school in your boundary. Your school near your house. Sorry, that's not a right in this country, right?
Yeah.
If we have a country where everyone pays taxes and everyone has a right to a public education, then that means we need to draw boundaries that are equitable, right? You know, what I hear, the excuses, and this is the euphemisms I hear from the white community in Portland whenever there's a debate about changing boundaries is walkability, right? Right? And what does walkability say? Right?
Well, yeah, you're in a neighborhood you can walk to
it. Right? Your kid being able to walk to their school when, you know, right? Where I was bused to schools, right? My kids can't walk to their schools. Some can, right? So that's it. Part of it is, right, well, you know, they're already with their friends. We can't break up their cohort. Like, what's gonna really, if you like so what? That happens. Whatever. People don't.
That when you move to this neighborhood already.
Totally right. It happens. Your kid will be fine. 2 more years of brand new friends. You can still hang out with those friends, right? And you know, and those are really the big excuses. Or like, I bought in this neighborhood because of the school. And none of those are valid excuses. But that's what sways the school board and the politicians. Sorry, I digress.
No, I mean, but it's kind of not a digression, because the thing is that Ida Wells stood for is she is unraveling all the systems of oppression relentlessly and in such a graceful, clever way, and then saying what to replace it with. And if that is not a theme that I have learned on my journey, I've always looked I look at racism, white supremacism as a condition and a disease. And I look at it in a way is that something we all have and it manifests differently. And obviously it's also in our system. And if I want to go deeper and more woo-woo about it, it is actually it's a shadow side of what we would call a shadow side of a deity. And we feed it with melanin. That's the blood of melanated people. And that's our systems. As I've gone into this process, I've wanted to know more practical information and learning more history, and so that is part of the work too. And I feel like she is this archetype of this, like, obviously protected. Obviously, she is protected. This protected warrior that shows us how to infiltrate system and what you need to do, how you need to do it, and what you need to do once you get there. And this is something that keeps, as I'm talking to my friend who works with gangs, and as I'm talking to my friend who works with houseless communities, and in terms of racism, they're talking about, like, You can't take somebody off the street, especially somebody who's been there for a long time, and not give them something to replace it. Shelters are great. There's no reason to get rid of shelters, but if you really want them to succeed, you have to give them something that they can be proud of, that they can feel purposeful. You have to have community for them to succeed. Same with the gangs.
Mhm.
You have to, these people on the streets who are shooting each other, they're human beings. Most of them don't want to live that life. They don't want to be in it, but that's where they're finding their community. That's where they're finding the most safety that they can imagine. So if you're going to take them off the streets and give them jobs, if you're going to give them work, they need to be ones that they can pay to feed their kids, and a place where they can live and feel safe and sleep at night so they can keep going to work, And so I think she tapped into that as far as how her activism went, and that is, here's what we can do instead. Right? It's not enough to just say, no, burn it down. But yes, burn it the fuck down. As far as I'm concerned, really, I'm speaking from just like, as I have spent so many hours trying to fix it in my head, and conversations we're trying to fix it all. And I'm just like, just burn it down. I mean, just these systems, burn them down. We will still be here. Human beings will still be here. But what do we replace it with? And that's where our community building comes in. She was doing that. She was showing like how you do this, how you come together for a common cause. I wanted to also put this quote right here.
Mm-hmm.
I remember after you were talking about the National Association of Colored Women, I remember coming across that, and I remember this quote right here: "Lifting as we climb." That is one of my favorite quotes, and it's something that I wish we could apply to the school system stuff you were talking about. Being able to understand our privileges. That it's really for understanding our privileges, using our skills, our wisdom to create what we want to create, and then bringing those. I think I love that aspect of activism. If I can take my skills in my community and we can create this thing to make the new world or whatever we want to see that helps people, makes the world a better place. How do we also bring people who might not understand this yet, but they want it, or people who want to learn, or people who really need it, that can respect it and honor it once it's put in their hands? How do we do that? I love that. Oops, I took it away. But lifting as we climb, that quote.
And I think that's important, right? We've got to meet people where at. You got to show grace, right? You've got to understand that most people are coming at you from a feeling of they don't want to be mean, they don't want to be asses, they just might not understand. Most humans you encounter are going to be empathetic and kind, and then the outliers, right? You just got to continue to work to try to get the outliers on board. But I think you're right. Ida B. Wells had it right? She had this idea of you've got to work within your community and work it within the community, particularly with the creation of the NAACP, which was the first interracial, civil rights organization in the country. Right? We've got to understand this is something for all of us to work towards and work together.
And I think this is something that comes up quite a bit. I've noticed. I love that she had that, and she also is mixed. Like she's light. She's mixed. I'm also mixed, but I'm from New Orleans. Like you can't see that I'm mixed, but I'm from New Orleans. Like if you look at my family tree, I'm obviously so many of us are mixed. Yeah. and
country.
Was that?
That's a Black experience in this country,
right? And totally. And I think that one thing that I am noticing is my sort of being repelled from this idea. There's all these layers, like you said, the onion, right? There's these layers, right? There are times when white people need to stop talking and listen, okay? There are times when Black voices need to be amplified, okay? There are times when white people really need to speak up a lot, and they really need to teach other white people, especially. I think maybe you or somebody else said there are times when white people have done their work and understand and have this knowledge of being able to articulate a Black experience to someone else who is white who will actually listen, right? And I have noticed that there's this sort of clashing going on of people feeling like we do need that complete segregation of like black people over here and white people over here completely in every way, and that white people should always shut up no matter what it is and should just be submissive. And to me, that's the tool of the oppressor being used to try to shut down the oppressor.
Yeah.
And right, and then you're right, so you have these things going on, but because so many of us are mixed, and because we live the way we do, I just don't see how it's possible to not do this together. I've not yet seen an argument yet that makes sense to me of black people should only work with black people, white people should only work with white people. I feel like that's playing right into white supremacism. It doesn't mean I still think there should be black spaces, people of color spaces. Absolutely. We have to have that. I also think that there should be white spaces, not white supremacist spaces. But spaces where white people can heal as white people, because they need to do that. Especially they need to go find some ancestry and like the connection to their new spirit. Yeah. But have you ever seen an argument that makes sense in our day and age in 2020 that's like white people and black people should do it their own way and completely separate? That makes sense?
No, I haven't, but I mean, I do understand kind of the black nationalist idea, right? I mean, that's an idea that is kind of, it's pretty long lived, That's where W.E.B. Du Bois was settled at the end of his life. Part of the reason why he went to Africa was that he believed that white culture and black culture were not compatible. Where I'm at, I don't think that's the right route. I understand. I'm empathetic with that viewpoint, right? Particularly if you look at kind of the history and the trauma of white supremacy in this country, it seems to make sense. As like a logical person, right? And I think of like the history, right? I was like a alien, right? And I came here and I looked at like the history of black people in America, and I read it. I'd be like, why would they want to be around those people when they got free? Okay? Why wouldn't they want to get away from it, right? I mean, if you were purely like a logical creature, right? But I think naturally, right? We're human beings, and we have an affinity for each other. We're a social creature, and a part of that transcends this construct we built of race.
Yeah. Taylor, I have 2 more questions for you before we come to the end of our time. Thank you for giving us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So juicy conversation. This is awesome, and I am sure I will call on you again because I know there's other people that you study. Mm-hmm. But first, let's look at this comment real quick. Ida B. Wells in the story The People's Grocery Co. was a light bulb moment for me. How white store owners routinely lynch successful black business owners who were their competition. And yeah, we talked about that. We talked about lynching happening for self-interest sometimes, through competition and people who are viewed as competition sometimes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It is a very, very tragic story and really kind of propelled her to the forefront of her activism. And it's a part of really that period, right? That nadir, as I talked about, the lowest period of race relations.
Yeah, and I'm gonna just for you, Carrie, I'm just gonna put more writings by her, the things that she was talking about during those times. If you're interested, this is a really cool site. The University of Chicago Library has a lot of her published work. Oh, did it go through? I don't know. Technology. There it goes. Here are my 2 last questions for you. Taylor Marrow, what would be your blessing for this world right now?
Let me think. So my blessing for the world would be the discovery of some sort of renewable technology.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right now, I think, with everything that's going on, we still haven't gotten anything that really kind of hurts my heart. And again, I'm not a scientist, right? And people can reject my belief and scientific belief on global climate change. But this is the fundamental problem of our generation, the fundamental problem of my lifetime that I've seen as like a young high schooler that read about, environmental, acid rain and pollution and environmental degradation when I was like 13 and 14, and it's only gotten worse in my lifetime. It's one of the things that are most tragic, and so I want to bless the world and find a way to get back to find a way to make energy and not and a really good byproduct.
Yeah, I second that. I second that blessing. And I feel like we're in a time that we have all that at our fingertips. I want to continue to be a better world holder, and I refuse to be. I hear a lot of cynicism about stuff like that, and I just can't get on board with the cynicism, because the cynicism is actually a big factor in the fact that these things don't get created or don't get funded or don't get implemented. Mm-hmm. And so I bless that is real, and that is going to happen in our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. Okay, my other question for you here is, if Taylor of 15 years ago walked into the door and sat down next to you right now, started sipping tea with you, what would you say?
Wow. Oh my God.
15 years ago. So however old you were 15 years ago.
Oh boy. Believe that Donald Trump will be the president. Because like 15 years without, like, yeah, Donald Trump would be the president, and we'd be stuck with a pandemic, and no Americans really caring about 200,000 people dead. I would not have thought about. There's no way 15 years ago I'd be like, yeah, Donald Trump will be the president. Yeah.
But back then he was still appearing as like cameos in movies, wasn't he?
So like I'm from New Jersey. We all know what he is. He's a grifter. He's always been a grifter. Like anyone from the East Coast knows that. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Simpsons. I love you. I love the Simpsons for predicting this crap.
Word. All right. So you have a book.
Yes.
You edited. It's called America Awakened: The Anti-Lynching Crusade of Ida B. Wells Burnett paperback.
Yes, and it's available in IndieBound, Amazon. I think Google might have Google Books. But yeah, so my job, which is I teach at a community college. We have really been trying to find ways to innovate, bringing down the cost of textbooks for our students. And
wow.
We've done this was to create a press within our job. And the goal is to have textbooks all of them be under $40. And so we've taken, what we do is we look for open resources. So the textbook I use in American history is an open resource. So my students can either access it for free, but if they're like me and like to, get a relationship with a book, they can buy it for $20 from the bookstore. And then the press put out a call for people wanted to, write an introduction and help edit and compose footnotes, and then an index glossary for some open source works. And I suggested the works of Ida B. Wells to use for my classes, because it's hard for me to find the book in print, and it came through the press. Mm-hmm.
That's really cool. I remember one of my semesters at CU Boulder. Mm-hmm. I think I had $720.
Yeah, textbooks are a racket, and we're really trying to work to bring them down.
Yeah, that wasn't in other supplies that I was forced to get. Like I had to get some, and I was like, what if you don't even have your job yet, like work study or something like that? Like what? So yeah. I really, as someone who carries college student debt, mm-hmm. I appreciate that so much. And if anybody is listening who's out there who's a college professor, hey, here's something you can do.
Mecca to press, right? It is good press. We have books that are inexpensive, and a whole host of subjects that have been, some completely written by our faculty and others kind of put together. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay. And is there anywhere else that you want people to find you?
They can find me on Facebook or Instagram. Instagram at The Punishing Professor. So at The Punishing Professor, or Instagram at Taylor Marrow.
The punishing professor. All right.
My MMA fight name. It's my mixed martial arts fight name.
I love it. And then also at Taylor Marrow.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, Taylor, thank you so much. I'm so glad we had this conversation.
It was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, super entertaining.
Yeah. I hope you come back. It was really lovely. Blessings.
Thank you. Good day. All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right.
Ia lá lá, ia lelé, são duas garotas do desacato. Ah lá lá, ia lelé, provoca até cenas de fuzilado. Ah lá lá, ia lelé, são duas garotas do desacato. Ah lá lá, ia lelé, provoca até cenas de fuzilado.